Okay, so last we left it, we were talking about the rectification campaign in Yan'an, where you had this flood of new recruits and soldiers coming into the communist ranks, and they're seeking to assert ideological control and instill unity, and also a discipline in terms of behavior of how the officials engage within the party with each other, but also with the wider Chinese public that's nominally under their rule at this time during the Second World War in the liberated areas and regions of North China. The targets of these campaigns were subjectivism, as labeled in one of the famous essays, and party formalism, which referred to the fact that some party members, especially in the Old Guard, held dogmatically to Marxist ideas and doctrines without heeding Mao's call to labor alongside the masses and to combine the practice of theory with the practice of actual action and physical labor, meaning you shouldn't just be an ideologue, you should actively practice what you preach, in one sense, is how Americans might come to call this idea. It also attacked the idea of sectarians. Sectarians were people who were condemned for creating cleavages within the party between groups, between old and these new party members, between soldiers and civilians, between certain ideas or groups rallying behind a particular leader. In essence, you could look at this as the party saying there's only going to be one clique at this time, and we've decided it will all be a clique that pledges allegiance to Mao and his particular theories and reflections on how Marxism will launch a revolution and found a modern state in China. So one clique. And especially individualism was attacked in the rectification campaigns. Intellectuals and artists were targeted in lectures given by Mao in 1942, where he demanded that art serve politics. Basically, art wasn't simply something for expression or as an articulation of the individual's own perspective. It was supposed to toe the party line. It was supposed to advocate for the participation of politics of peasants and glorify their lives as moral and upright and as the people who are at the vanguard of their nation. And it should also do things like undermine the interests of capitalists and depict them in a negative light. In later decades, a lot of people that were attracted to the Chinese Communist cause are going to find that these directives completely stifled their freedom of expression. The most notable case is the feminist author Ding Ling, who in the 1920s was praised for her short stories and essays kind of depicting the abuse of patriarchy and how it marginalized women and denied them rights. Well, she finds that from within the Chinese Communist Party movement, she is not above reproach for depicting the ways in her short stories that men, as officials, as cadre leaders, and as ideologues could abuse their authority over women and exploit them in many of the same ways that she found prevalent throughout China's middle class. Well, that kind of expression, while lauded when targeting the middle class, industrialists and bankers, was denounced and condemned as rightist or counter-revolutionary and out of line with the thoughts of Mao Zedong in the 1950s. So art has to have the right politics, and it must serve the interests of the party. That's something that's already demanded of Communist Party members in 1942 and 1943. To enforce these directives, the Chinese Communist Party developed a very severe method for ideological campaigns, defined by several stages. Individuals were demanded or coerced into penning self-criticisms from the vantage point of the party. Then, publicly, they were humiliated in struggle meetings where the general public or particular individuals cast them off as committing crimes against the party and against the revolution. And then later they were jailed or terrorized if they would not submit to the party's authority. The last theme then that we want to deal with, after kind of charting Mao's rise and his thoughts as becoming supreme within his own revolution, is the efforts of the United States to support and force the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party to come together at the end of the Second World War to form a coalition government. By 1943, the Soviet Union had fought off the Nazi invasion at Stalingrad, The Allies were victorious in North Africa, and the U.S. had stopped the Japanese advance across the Pacific and was in the process of rolling it back towards the home islands of Tokyo. The loss of Axis momentum forced Japan to relax its pressure on North China and ushered in the process of Allied negotiations for the post-war era in East Asia. The Roosevelt administration was optimistic that a Republican China, initially, could fill the power vacuum in the region left by the fall of Japan. But its forces on the ground, foreign service officers, members of the American embassy, and commanders like General Stilwell produced reports warning that the Kuomintang was rife with corruption and flagging inapproval with the public. And at the same time, they published some grudging admiration for the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party and its effective mobilization of the countryside. Still, on the home front within the United States, Christian impulses and powerful allies of the Kuomintang media and Congress demanded that the United States fully commit itself to Chiang Kai-shek as the sole legitimate leader of the Chinese people. The result was that Washington sent emissaries in the form of Generals Patrick Hurley and later George Marshall to work towards the creation of a coalition government shared by the Chinese Communist Party in Kuomintang. The idea of a coalition government sharing power has been labeled by most historians as hopelessly naive, the result of a fundamental ignorance on the part of the U.S. to understand the history of betrayal and bitter infighting between the two parties, but it also reflected the general attitude of the majority of Chinese near the end of the war. Refugee students and faculty in Kunming, within Free China, the area governed by the Kuomintang, demanded the government in Chongqing promise to extend the goals behind the United Front into a plan for the post-war peace. They hoped to avoid a civil war. The idea of a coalition government was broadly popular, though, with a war-weary nation that saw neither group as enjoying a decisive advantage of the other, meaning they were likely to continue a struggle for power that would only fragment and decimate China even more. Careful not to run afoul of the Chinese peace movement, is what we're going to call it, both Mao and Chiang Kai-shek publicly talked optimistically about the viability of a coalition government. But privately, the two parties prepared for a war that they thought was inevitable. The prime objective of the U.S. attempt to coerce the two sides to share power was to prevent the Soviet Union from using a later entry into the Pacific War against Japan, once the war in Europe came to a close, as a platform to take over Northeast Asia. For their part, the Soviets signed a treaty at Yalta in 1945, recognizing Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist regime as the one true sovereign government of China, and also said that they would not openly offer aid and material to the Chinese Communist Party in its struggle against Chiang Kai-shek. It didn't matter. Despite repeated negotiations in 1945 and 1946 and occasional ceasefires, there was really no contingent within the two parties that believed coexistence was possible. Those prospects were repeatedly dashed from 1927, during the Northern Expedition, to the point of attack on the new Fourth Army in 1941, and on and on and on again. Adding to the tensions was that the U.S. compromised its integrity as a mediator by clearly favoring the Kuomintang. After 1945, 53,000 U.S. Marines were stationed in Beijing and Tianjin to guard against Soviet incursion, while American air and naval power was used to rush the nationalist armies from their wartime capital back to the coastal areas and areas of occupied Japan that were being surrendered and abandoned. Aid and weapons from the U.S. flowed only to the Kuomintang, despite both being allies of the United States in the Pacific War, although much of it was later intercepted and wound up in the hands of the People's Liberation Army or the Communists. Lastly, the Japanese army was ordered to surrender only to the Kuomintang forces. So when Chinese communist armies began taking ground in northern China, Chiang Kai-shek actually ordered Japanese imperial officials to fight back. And so fighting was renewed even after Japan had formally surrendered in northern China. Together, these two facts, U.S. weaponry shoring up the nationalists at a low point in their power and popularity, and the Kuomintang again preferring to compromise with Japanese invaders to fight against what the public saw as Chinese patriots, were eventually weaponized by the CCP's propaganda. And the United States was held at particular fault for prolonging a civil war that should have been over much more quicker, if not for America's intervention. Where does that leave us? Hopefully from today's lecture, you saw a number of important points. What we might call the nationalist government's practice of survivalist rule, losing its revenue and political base by being forced to remove far into the west. It also lost its best armies in many campaigns, such as the Ichigo offensive that you read about. And because of that weakness, it became overly reliant on strongman methods to hold on to power, and especially dependent on outside patronage and support, and aid, weaponry, and loans from the United States. We also saw in the north that the Chinese are not just going strong in numbers, but they're growing strong through their ability to sinify Marxism, to make it appealing to the masses, to use Chinese philosophy, history, and concepts, to make it somehow ingrained within the fabric of what's happening with the invasion of Japan and imperialist power, and the struggle of peasants under the thumb of powerful landlords, sometimes more powerful in their figure and symbolic authority than they actually are in terms of wealth. And we also see the basis for the later revolution and expansion of their armies over the course of the Civil War and some of the defining reforms launched in the first years of Chinese communist rule: peasant mobilization and land reform, and then periodic recurrent mass campaigns designed to promote ideological conformity to the thoughts and theories of Mao, and also solidarity within all levels of Chinese society. And the last point that we want to stress is that the U.S. intervention and aid for the Kuomintang compromised their post-war plans for a coalition government. But ultimately, this idea was probably faulty because there was no true intent by either Mao or Chiang Kai-shek to actually work for that, despite that being for a time in 1945 and 1946 a sincere wish that would have pleased the masses. It was something that the Chinese desired, in part because they thought that their civil war was likely to be indecisive, prolonged, and as deadly as the past 8 years had been in struggling against Japan. Okay, so got a little bit off track. The video took a little bit more than I wanted it to. Please don't hesitate to ask questions or ask me to go back to fix slides or to clarify things either through email or more videos. Take care of your health, be well, and get some rest this week. Thanks.